So you want to get into the Airbnb business. Between the city, the banks, the insurance company, the HOAs, and the county, these are the 5 things that are absolutely killing my Airbnb business in 2025. So whether you are already in the Airbnb space or you're thinking about jumping in 2025 because you heard about how all the short-term rental hosts were just running away with it, you need to pay attention to this video. This video is about the 5 things that were killing our business in 2024, what we've had to do differently in 2025 to make that same rental business profitable again. Let's get into it. You know, as soon as people find out that you host an Airbnb, they just assume that you're making a ton of money. In the beginning, when we started on Vrbo and then migrated over to Airbnb, so we host on both platforms, it was really good. There was not a lot of competition. People were new to the platform. We were able to command a premium nightly rate. And then as more and more people caught on to the trend and entered into the market, it quickly became a race to the bottom. You know, let's just say originally there was maybe like 200 or 300 people on the platform in our city. That grew to over 1,000 people. So you've got the same host competing for the same guests. So this video is going to be about the 5 things that are killing my Airbnb business. Number 1 is the bankers. So when we started, the interest rates were like 3%. And so you could borrow $500,000. You take that times 0.03, that's $15,000 a year in interest. If you divide that by 12, that's $1,250 a month for the interest. If you divide that by 30 nights, that comes out to $42 a night. So that means to be a host and to do everything it takes to furnish a property and bring it to market and offer it for rental by the night, let's just say $300 a night, it's costing me $42 a night just in interest. To make all that happen, at the end of the day, it's $42. Today, that same $500,000 at 7.5%, it's costing me $37,500 in interest. Now, if we take that $37,500 and divide it by 12, that's $3,125 a month just in interest, just the carry cost. If we divide that by 30, that's $104 per night. So whereas before it was costing me $42 a night in interest to offer a place for $300 a night, now it's costing me $104. So basically a third of my revenue just to pay the interest on the banknote to get the money to do all this. The second thing that's killing my Airbnb business is the insurance rates. So whereas before, you know, you could get insurance on the property, let's say it was maybe like, you know, $2,000 a year. Now it's costing double that. It's costing $4,000 a year. So just do the math on that. The third thing that's killing my Airbnb business is the HOAs. So when we first started in one particular neighborhood downtown that has an HOA, the HOA CCRs, the restrictions, they were silent on Airbnbs. So you could get your license from the city as long as you were following what all the city requirements. Then you could run an Airbnb in the neighborhood. And it was me and 2 other neighbors in this neighborhood were running Airbnbs. None of them were a problem. None of them were throwing parties. None of them were problem houses. And none of the neighbors had any complaint other than the fact that they didn't like that there was an Airbnb on their block. So what they did is they got together, you know, at their meetings, and they decided that they were going to amend the CCRs to outlaw short-term rentals. So whereas before, you might have come in, made an investment, and bought a house, fixed it up, furnished it just to put it on Airbnb because, you know, you could make double the revenue, cover your mortgage, and still cash flow. Not anymore. Nope. Hey, we don't want short-term rentals in our neighborhood. So just like they've regulated in the past saying they don't want long-term rentals, now they're saying we don't want short-term rentals. One of the first things you really got to pay attention to is the CCRs of an HOA. Whether or not it allows for a long-term rental or a short-term rental, all kinds of stuff, right? And so the HOAs are basically making it more difficult to scale the business because they don't want it in their backyard. The fourth thing the city regulation. Now, when we started in 2016, there really was no regulation. The short-term rentals were considered illegal, but there was zero enforcement. And because there was zero enforcement, it was kind of like the Wild Wild West. You didn't have to pay to get on the platform. You didn't have to pay license fees. There was no taxation. And so there was an arbitrage that existed that allowed us to do very well as a small business owner. But what happened was the Airbnb hosts started slowly cutting into the hotels. And so what they did is they organized, the local hotel people organized, and then they hired a lobbyist to lobby the city council. And it's always the same thing on the news. You hear about the Airbnbs are horrible, everybody's partying, they're taking up all the parking, there's trash everywhere, and then that evolves into the prices are going up on the real estate, and there's a shortage of housing because all these Airbnb hosts are buying up all the property. I mean, that's the propaganda that you'll see on the news to kind of get the public behind the agenda. And so what the city did was they drafted an ordinance. They basically copied Portland, Oregon. And it wasn't that big of a deal. You had to register your property, you had to pay a fee, but then you also had to get consent of 60% of your neighbors. So what that meant is if you had 5 neighbors, basically 3 of them had to say, yeah, I'm cool with it, you can have an Airbnb there. But if 3 out of 5 said, no, I'm not cool with it, then you couldn't get the license. You'd have to basically shut down your Airbnb. The other thing they did was they restricted the zoning, so you could no longer open an Airbnb out in the suburbs. Now, if you were existing in the suburbs, they allowed you to go ahead and get that first license and then renew thereafter. And you also had to submit like 5 or 6 affidavits. They had to be notarized, but you only had to register one time and then you pay a renewal fee. And so everybody adapted to that. Everybody was doing fine. And then about 2 years into that, they got more restrictive and they scrapped the old ordinance and they brought out a new ordinance. Now this was spearheaded by what I heard was by Expedia. So they actually hired a lobby firm and were lobbying the municipalities to get more restrictive on the Airbnb hosts. So what happened with the new ordinance is that they actually outlawed it. So you could no longer even open an Airbnb in residential zoning, period. Whether you were in the city or in the suburbs, it wasn't even allowed. You had to be in a commercial zoning or an urban renewal zoning, which is an area where they're trying to encourage development, which is fine. There's some urban renewal areas around downtown that make it possible. But if you were thinking that you were going to try to scale your business, they just outlawed it and said you could no longer have a new license in residential zoning, which included the areas around downtown, Midtown, just Plaza area, all these areas that were popular for Airbnbs because they're close to downtown. Now, in addition to that, you also had to now get a tax clearance letter. You had to set up get a business license for each individual property. So whether you have 3 or 30, that would require 30 business licenses. And then also you had to have an annual inspection. Now this is a physical inspection from neighborhood housing. And not only do they do that, but they do it every year. So you have to take time out of your day or send somebody over there to meet them and just come in and pass that inspection. It's not hard to pass, it's just one more thing. In addition to that, what they did was they started treating us like a hotel and say, oh, well, you guys are hosting, then now you have to collect the hotel tax, like 7.5% plus $3 per night. You have to collect that from the guest and you have to remit that quarterly. What that means is now every 3 months, I have to take a morning out of my life, 4 hours, and aggregate all that data and submit the payment. The other thing that they did with the new ordinance is they said, okay, now you can have a maximum 8 guests. It doesn't matter if you have an 8-bedroom or a 4-bedroom, it's 2 guests per room plus 1, maximum 8. And we actually got in trouble for this because we have a 5-bedroom house. And we saw that, so we had changed it to 8 guests in our listing, and then we noticed that our competition was still doing like 10 guests, 16 guests, whatever. And so we thought, we have 5 bedrooms, we're gonna push it to 10. So we advertised 10 guests, And then the city somehow caught wind of that, either through some kind of AI that's scrubbing the platform, or a neighbor dropped a dime on us, we're not sure, but sure enough, they sent us a ticket for unsafe advertising practices, had to pay a fine, $250, because we were advertising that we could host 10 guests in our 5-bedroom house. The fifth thing that's absolutely killing my Airbnb business is the county. So just this past year, just like every other year, the county sends out their reassessment. And so the annual property taxes on our best house was about $4,000 a year. And we had noticed that the county had upped the value of the house from $300 to like $450. And so our property taxes were going to go from $4,000 to $6,000. So what happened was we challenged it and said, no, that's not fair. We went through the process, and as we were talking to the head lady, the county collector, through email, she said, "Hey, aren't you running an Airbnb in that property?" I replied back, "Yes, we are running a licensed Airbnb." And she already knew that because the city had provided the county with a list of all the short-term rentals in the county, so that the county could go in and change the classification from residential to commercial. So the residential tax rate in the county is 19%. The commercial rate is 32%. Plus they charge a fee for every commercial property on top of the 32%. So what happened was it went up almost 3x year over year. So it went from 4,000 to 11,000 in 1 year. So almost a 300% increase between the city, the banks, the insurance company, the HOAs, and the county. These 5 things are killing my Airbnb business. Before you take a look at starting an Airbnb, running a short-term rental business, you have to really be aware of the challenges that you're going to face. In addition to that, don't think because you can run a long-term rental business effectively and profitable that you can do the same thing with a short-term rental business, because they're not the same thing. One is being a landlord, the other is running a hospitality business. So with our Airbnb business on life support, we had to come up with a solution. The solution is midterm rentals, not long-term rentals, not short-term rentals, but a hybrid in between, midterm rentals. What does that mean? So most short-term rentals, you rent the property out for 1, 2, 3 nights, maybe a week, but definitely not more than 2 weeks. A midterm rental and then a long-term rental is like 6 months or a year or multi-years. A midterm rental is going to be 2 weeks, 30 days, 2 months, 3 months. It's kind of like the old corporate rental. Now, there are some major advantages to the midterm rental. Number one, your nightly rate is about the same as it is on a short-term rental. Number two, it's much less time consuming. It's not as hands-off as a long-term rental, but rather than having to deal with inquiries every day, putting out fires every week, you get somebody in there for 1 or 2 months, then you get the same rent, but the same high rent, but less of the problems. And so it has really helped us weather the storm of all the Airbnb problems. The other thing is you don't have to buy quite so many supplies. With the short-term rental, you have to restock every time every guest checks out, whether that be laundry soap, toilet paper, paper towels, dish soap, coffee pods, you name it. With a midterm rental, you supply all that stuff up front, but then when they run out, they have to go to the grocery store and restock it themselves. So you're not constantly having that expense week in, week out. Another good thing about the midterm rental is they may find you on the short-term rental platform and book for the first 30 days, but a lot of times they want to stay for 2 or 3 months. And so you can convert that on-platform booking to an off-platform booking. What that does is it's going to save both sides of the transaction paying the platform fees, which can save the guest 20%, which makes it much more appealing for them to renew for a second or third month. You're also not subject to the same licensing or the same regulation as a short-term rental. Remember, the short-term rentals are regulated for stays less than 30 days. So if your target is to get guests for 1 or 2 months, then you're not going to be subject to those same regulations. I thank you for tuning into this video. I hope that you found value in it. I hope that it made you think about some things that maybe you weren't thinking about before. And I hope that you subscribe to our channel and that we catch you on the next video. I thank you for your attention, and I will see you on the next video. Hey wealth makers, this video is sponsored by Mike Jones's new book, Deed Rich, Tax Sale Secrets, how you can make generational wealth with real estate in one lifetime.